So now we move to the issue of Vietnam. Looking back on where it all began, Ho Chi Minh had been a leader of the Viet Minh movement to resist Japanese occupation during World War II of what was then French Indochina. He later led efforts to resist the French attempt to reassert control after the war. At the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the Vietnamese were able to score a decisive victory over the French, and after the Geneva Conference in 1954, Ho Chi Minh would establish himself as the communist leader in the northern part of Vietnam, while Ngo Dinh Diem would emerge as the leader in the southern part of Vietnam. Under the terms of the Geneva Accords, Vietnam was to be temporarily divided along the 17th parallel. Elections were supposed to be held to create a unified country, separate from Cambodia and Laos, which was the other two countries that made up the former French Indochina. But with the north occupied by communists and the south occupied by those who opposed it, those elections never happened. By 1960, the National Liberation Front, or NLF, had been established, called the Viet Cong by Americans. Its goal was to attempt to bring about the unification as had been promised years earlier at Geneva. In addition to being a political entity, they also had their own fighters. But Diem's regime opposed the NLF, and he used the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, also known as the South Vietnamese Army, to try and combat them, claiming that the Viet Cong were forces supported by the North Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh. This position would also be widely accepted by the Western nations, who lent assistance to the Diem regime, including the United States. The North Vietnamese insisted they had nothing to do with the existence of the NLF, calling the conflict a civil war within South Vietnam, not influenced by Hanoi. But fearing communist infiltration of the South, Diem ordered the army to shoot and kill anyone suspected of being a communist, and thus began a particularly harsh regime. Now, the United States had been interested in Vietnam and had a bit of an advisory role dating back to 1954. But beginning in 1961, JFK sent 400 special advisors to Vietnam, and even sent Vice President Lyndon Johnson on a fact-finding tour of the region. Lyndon Johnson was of the belief that the United States must decide whether to assist the free countries of Asia or throw in the towel and pull back our defenses to San Francisco when it came to the expansion of communism in the region. Therefore, the issue of Vietnam was going to be part of the larger Cold War policy, which was about containment, where the United States wanted to prevent the fall of any nation to communism. Kennedy's Pentagon advisors suggested to him that it would take about 40,000 men to defeat communists in Southeast Asia, which, as it turns out, was a severe underestimation. The ambassador to the area, Henry Cabot Lodge, warned JFK that Diem was a problem and a liability, and that America would lose Vietnam if he remained in power much longer. The assistance of those special advisors, and with the assistance of the CIA, the South Vietnamese carried out assassinations of North Vietnamese officials, and it turns out some Americans were involved in that directly. By 1963, more than 2,600 special advisors were stationed in South Vietnam, many of them Green Berets, who were often sent out on special search and destroy missions focusing on targets in North Vietnam. By mid-1963, opposition to the Diem government had grown tremendously, and Buddhist monks were even protesting the harshness of his regime by setting themselves on fire in public suicides to focus the world's attention on their plight. By late 1963, JFK had increased the number of American troops in Vietnam to approximately 17,000. And instead of advisors, more and more of them were being used for combat. Each month progressed, the situation in Vietnam deteriorated. Then in October of 1963, Diem, the president of South Vietnam, along with the vice president Ngo Dinh Diem, his brother-in-law, were assassinated. The plot was actually formulated by American CIA agents, though it was carried out by South Vietnamese generals. At this point, JFK decided to withdraw American troops, believing that Vietnam would be an unwinnable war. But he was incredibly busy and had a few things to attend to first, so he wrote out a memo, placed it in his desk, with the plan to release it publicly upon his return from a campaign trip to Dallas, Texas. Of course, a trip he never returned from. Lyndon Johnson believed that the Soviet Union were trying to take over all of Southeast Asia, and he wanted to win the war that JFK had come to believe would be unwinnable. But Johnson did not have the votes in Congress for a formal declaration of war. Then in August of 1964, the USS Maddox, disguised as a fishing boat and spying on North Vietnamese communication, came under fire in the Gulf of Tonkin and after straying into North Vietnamese territorial waters. 3 days later, LBJ said that the Maddox had been attacked a second time in international waters, so Congress quickly passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed Lyndon Johnson to use as many troops as needed for as long as necessary to protect American lives overseas. Essentially, it was a blank check in order to conduct the war in Vietnam. And this was on the eve of a presidential election. After he won that re-election, he decided to escalate U.S. involvement in the war, and by 1965 there was approximately 100,000 troops in Vietnam. He hoped that by escalating the war he could get it over with quickly and show his critics that he could be just as tough on communism as JFK had been. He would make extensive use of the selective service system, or the draft, during his administration, and more young men would be drafted for service in Vietnam, although many at home sought means of avoiding the draft. One way you could do this was by enlisting in the National Guard or Reserve, since few actually were sent to Vietnam. For those who could meet the more stringent enlistment standards, service in the Air Force, the Navy, or the Coast Guard was also a means of reducing the chances of having to serve in Vietnam or potentially being killed. You also saw vocations to the ministry and rabbinate increase because divinity students were exempt from the draft. But interestingly, though the draft continued through December of 1973, and once drafted you were only required to serve a year, the vast majority of Vietnam soldiers were volunteers. Of course, many volunteered to avoid the draft itself, where they could have some choice in where they were sent. Since many of those eligible for the draft were baby boomers and in college in the 1960s, it stands to reason that college campuses would be the primary location for draft protest and anti-war activities. The first draft card burnings took place on college campuses. At UC Berkeley, students laid down on railroad tracks to try and stop tube trains from taking draftees away. Those that opposed the war and felt it was a civil war in which the U.S. did not need to be involved would be nicknamed the Doves, and those that supported it, who believed that it was a Soviet-backed plan to take over all of Southeast Asia, were nicknamed the Hawks. College students tended to mostly be Doves, and the older generation were more likely to be Hawks. February of 1968, after yet another official report claiming that the war was almost over, the U.S. government had inklings that a major offensive was planned by the Viet Cong, though they ignored them. But on the occasion of Tet, the Lunar New Year, the Viet Cong launched what came to be called the Tet Offensive. It was a massive attack on virtually every large city in South Vietnam, including all of the district capitals. The U.S. Army counterattacked and recaptured every location, but the Tet Offensive would prove to be a turning point in the entire war, because it was a psychological victory, as the American public had generally believed government reports that the war was almost over, and now they were coming to realize that the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, were never going to give up. Supposedly, they had been on the brink of defeat and unable to launch any offensive, and Tet proved that wrong. Escalation of the war in Vietnam caused anti-war protests to break out again all over the country. And of course, you had two groups that had formed. The Hawks, mostly the older generation, veterans of both World War I and World War II, believed that the war was a communist attempt to take over all of Southeast Asia. The Doves, mostly the younger generation, believed that the war was immoral and supported a corrupt regime that America did not need to be responsible for. The difference led to the so-called generation gap with regards to the support of the war. After the disaster that was the Tet Offensive, and early in the 1968 primary election campaign, Lyndon Johnson publicly stated that he would not seek, nor would he accept, the nomination of his party to be president for the following term. His popularity was at an all-time low, and he was not doing well in the primaries, facing serious competition from within his own party for the Democratic nomination. Senator Eugene McCarthy, whose campaign ran a slogan of "Get Clean for Gene," as well as Governor George Wallace of Alabama, were challenging him, though George Wallace eventually bolted from the Democratic Party and established the American Independent Party, which was largely anti-civil rights. And then there was Robert Kennedy, who of course could provide a connection back to the so-called era of Camelot, and he was quite popular. There was also the final possibility of the sitting Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Even with Johnson out of the primary campaigns, the competition was fierce. In June of 1968, Bobby Kennedy won a major victory at the California primary, cementing his place as the Democratic frontrunner. But just seconds after delivering a victory speech at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, he was shot and killed by a Palestinian nationalist named Sirhan Sirhan. He had opposed Kennedy's support for Israel at a time when Israel, Egypt, and Syria were warring over control of the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, in the aftermath of the Six-Day War that had been fought late in 1967. When Kennedy died, he left behind a pregnant wife and 10 children. His assassination coming just 2 months after that of Martin Luther King Jr., and their assassinations became the turning point in the counterculture movement, dividing the counterculture into two groups, the pacifists and the radicals, really not unlike the split in the civil rights movement, peaceful civil disobedience versus the Black Power movement. The pacifists were opposed to war for any reason and wanted to achieve their aims by hosting marches, sit-down protests, petitions, and in general supported peaceful civil disobedience. The radicals, taking their cue from the Black Power groups of the civil rights movement, supported a much more confrontational approach, believing that the end would justify the means. And they wanted to end the Vietnam War in any way possible, even if it meant breaking laws or damaging property. On the Republican side, the Republican Party had a relatively easy time in selecting former Vice President Richard Nixon as their running mate, along with vice presidential candidate Spiro Agnew, the former governor of Maryland. Together they would run on a campaign slogan of peace with honor and claim to represent the silent majority of the American public, supporting a law and order platform. But it was the 1968 Democratic Convention, which was held in Chicago, that generated the most attention and the most tension. Chicago was the home of Mayor Richard Daley, the last of the city bosses elected by a political machine. He held such power in Chicago that he'd actually been elected mayor 6 times and had been instrumental in helping JFK to win the election in 1960, although some believe Mayor Daley's help amounted to voter fraud. With the nation divided by the Vietnam War and with the assassinations of King and Kennedy just a few months earlier, the city of Chicago would become a battleground for anti-Vietnam War protesters who vowed to shut down the convention. Daley was determined not to let those groups embarrass the city of Chicago or the Democratic Party. He'd actually been criticized to some extent for his overcautious police response to rioting in the aftermath of King's assassination, and he was determined that it would not happen again. One of the organizers of the protests were the Youth Independent Party, or the Yippies, founded by Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. They wanted to bring about change by showing what a farce the whole political system in the United States had become. They encouraged large numbers of people to descend on the city of Chicago, and confrontations between protesters and police became commonplace and frequently turned violent, and images of this violence was broadcast on national television. Demonstrators chanted, "The whole world is watching," as the Chicago Police Department charged in with billy clubs and mace. The violence associated with the convention came to be called the Days of Rage and would hurt the Democratic Party. Of course, in the midst of all this, there's still the political aspect of the convention, and fights even broke out on the convention floor. Eventually, Hubert Humphrey became the Democratic nominee, but the damage was largely done. Because of the violence associated with the Democratic convention, Richard Nixon and the Republican Party won the presidency that fall. As part of the aftermath of the convention, 8 protesters would be arrested and charged with various federal crimes. The judge assigned to the case was handpicked by Mayor Daley, and the jury that was selected were all white, middle-aged men. No women, no minorities, and no young people on the jury. Tom Hayden, one of the organizers of Students for a Democratic Society, Bobby Seale of the Black Panthers, and Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman of the Yippies were 4 of the original 8 that were indicted. At one point, Bobby Seale demanded to be his own lawyer, though the judge refused his request, and when Seale kept interrupting the proceedings, asking questions and trying to cross-examine witnesses, the judge ordered him bound and gagged and chained to his chair for the duration of the trial. Eventually, Bobby Seale had his case severed from the other, and so instead of the Chicago 8, the trial became known as the Chicago 7 trial. All 7 of the defendants, and Bobby Seale as well, were eventually found guilty of contempt of court, although all were acquitted of conspiracy. They would all be sentenced to prison, though their convictions would later be overturned by the U.S. Court of Appeals because the process had violated their basic constitutional rights, and none of them ever ended up actually serving any prison time. Later government investigations would turn the Days of Rage into a police riot. Begin the final portion of the decade and into the 1970s, a time period of both stalemate and scandal. In January of 1969, Richard Nixon took the oath of office for the presidency and almost immediately initiated peace talks for the war in Vietnam, with those talks being held in the city of Paris. The whole thing an effort to fulfill his campaign promise of ending the war. But just because peace talks had begun did not mean that they were actually successful. In fact, an agreement was not reached until early in 1973. In general, though, Nixon had a goal of turning over the efforts in Vietnam to the Vietnamese military and to withdraw U.S. troops, a process he called Vietnamization. He would withdraw U.S. troops, but would continue to give the South Vietnamese military the money, weapons, and equipment it needed to continue the war effort. This seemed to please many Americans and reduced anti-war protest activities for a time. But in April of 1970, he effectively expanded the war by using U.S. ground troops to attack neighboring Cambodia in an effort to destroy Vietnamese communist bases in that country and to stop the delivery of supplies from North Vietnam to the Viet Cong along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The result was a surge in protests, particularly at colleges and universities, resulting in the National Guard troops being called out to protect ROTC and administration buildings, as many colleges supported the military efforts, both with research as well as officer training programs. At Kent State University in Ohio, National Guardsmen fired on a crowd of protesters, killing 4 students. 2 more would be killed at Jackson State in Mississippi, although their protests were less about the war and more concerned about continued racism in the South, and especially the fact that it was easier to be drafted if you were black than if you were white. As Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young would later put it, there were 4 dead in Ohio. About the time that Nixon gave orders to secretly invade Cambodia, word leaked to the press about U.S. government policy regarding Vietnam. That leak was provided by Daniel Ellsberg, a military analyst. He gave it to the New York Times, and they were calling the information they gave him the Pentagon Papers. The Nixon administration tried to block the publication of information in those papers and challenged the New York Times all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. But in the case of the New York Times v. United States, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the New York Times and the First Amendment right to freedom of the press. The Pentagon Papers caused significant controversy because, although they were a top-secret government document, they illustrated that almost from the very beginning that the U.S. government had believed the war in Vietnam was unwinnable. Consequently, anti-war protests would become even more violent and more frequent. And about the same time as the publication of the Pentagon Papers, word became public of the My Lai massacre, which, although it had occurred in March of 1968, was not public knowledge until into the 1970s. Members of the United States Army, according to official reports, had killed approximately 130 Viet Cong soldiers. In reality, the United States Army soldiers had killed between 340 and 500 unarmed civilians in the small Vietnamese village of My Lai. Most of the victims were women and children, with many of them infants. There were no enemy fighters. They were all civilian. Eventually, some 26 soldiers would be charged with various criminal offenses, though only one was actually convicted. The incident sparked global outrage and finally helped turn the tide of public opinion against the war in the United States, demanding an end to U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Largely because of this, peace talks would resume in earnest, and a peace agreement between the United States and the North Vietnamese was signed in January of 1973. According to the terms of the treaty, all U.S. troops were to be withdrawn from Southeast Asia, and all American prisoners of war were to be released. It did not end the war in Vietnam itself, as North Vietnamese troops were allowed to remain and to continue their war against the South Vietnamese army. Following the treaty, though, U.S. monetary aid to the South was cut dramatically, and as U.S. troops began leaving South Vietnam, the South Vietnamese military was effectively at the mercy of communist troops. In 1975, North Vietnam launched a major offensive, and without the presence of American troops, the risk of the fall of South Vietnam, and in particular the capital of Saigon, was very real. Thousands of loyal South Vietnamese began to flood the American embassy to try and escape what they felt was an inevitable communist takeover. And within just 2 months, the city of Saigon fell and the last evacuations took place. As the U.S. ferried individuals to waiting aircraft carriers, as aircraft and helicopters ran out of fuel, they pushed them overboard and into the sea to prevent them from ending up in the hands of the North Vietnamese military. But for the most part, the United States no longer cared about the happenings in Vietnam, because by then, the Watergate scandal was the focus of the United States.